In the basement archives of St. Bartholomew's Medical Institute, fluorescent lights hummed over rows of filing cabinets that hadn't been opened in decades. The air smelled of old paper and preservative chemicals, a scent that had become as familiar to Sarah Chen as her morning coffee. As the Institute's head archivist, she had spent the better part of 3 years cataloging the mountain of historical documents that previous administrations had simply stored away and forgotten. It was on a particularly gray October morning that Sarah discovered the photograph that would unravel everything she thought she knew about early sleep research. The image was tucked between routine medical reports from 1906, its edges yellowed but remarkably clear. At first glance, it appeared utterly mundane. A clinical study room with a patient lying in bed, a researcher seated at a nearby desk taking notes. The photograph bore the institutional stamp of the Morpheus Sleep Research Laboratory, a facility that had operated briefly in the early 1900s before mysteriously closing its doors. Sarah almost filed it away without a second thought. Almost. But something about the composition nagged at her, a detail that seemed slightly out of place in what should have been a straightforward documentation of scientific procedure. On the wall behind the sleeping subject, barely visible in the photograph's shadows, was a dark shape that didn't quite belong to any of the visible furniture or people in the room. The shadow was elongated, vaguely human in form, but distorted in a way that suggested movement, or perhaps a trick of the light. She made a note in her catalog and moved on, but the image lingered in her mind throughout the day. That evening, she found herself returning to the photograph, studying it under a magnifying glass. The shadow was definitely there, and it definitely didn't match anything else in the room. The researcher's position was clearly documented, the patient was lying flat, and the furniture cast predictable shadows in the opposite direction. This anomaly seemed to exist independently of everything else captured in the frame. 3 weeks later, Sarah received an unexpected email that would transform her curiosity into something approaching obsession. The sender was Michael Thornton, a genealogy enthusiast from Portland who had been researching his family history. His great-grandfather, he explained, had participated in a sleep study in 1906, and he had recently inherited a collection of personal documents from that period. He had found Sarah's contact information through the Institute's website and wondered if she might have any records related to the Morpheus Laboratory. Sarah's pulse quickened as she read the email. She immediately replied, explaining that she had indeed found materials from the laboratory and would be happy to share what she had discovered. Within days, Michael had driven down from Portland with a worn leather journal that had belonged to his great-grandfather, Edmund Thornton. The journal entries began mundanely enough, describing Edmund's agreement to participate in what he understood to be a routine study of sleep patterns. The researcher, identified only as Professor Whitmore, had promised a modest payment in exchange for several nights of observation. Edmund's initial entries were matter-of-fact, noting the clinical setting and the professor's professional demeanor. But as the study progressed, Edmund's tone began to change. He wrote of strange dreams that felt more real than waking life, of a presence in the room that seemed to watch him, even when the professor was absent. Most disturbing were his descriptions of a shadow on the wall that appeared to move independently of any light source, sometimes seeming to reach toward his bed before retreating back into the darkness. November 15th, 1906. One entry read, "The shadow appeared again tonight. Professor Whitmore insists it is merely a trick of the gaslight, but I have watched it carefully. It moves with purpose, not with the random flickering of flame. When I asked the professor about it directly, his eyes became distant, and he changed the subject to my sleep patterns. I begin to suspect that this study is not what it appears to be." Sarah cross-referenced Edmund's journal with the photograph she had found, and the timeline matched perfectly. More intriguingly, Edmund's descriptions of the shadow's appearance aligned exactly with what she could see in the image. This was no longer a photographic curiosity. It was corroborated testimony from the actual subject of the study. Determined to find more evidence, Sarah returned to the archives with renewed purpose. Deep in the collection, she discovered a second photograph from the same study, apparently taken on a different night. The setting was identical, but Edmund's position in the bed had changed slightly, and Professor Whitmore was absent from the frame. Most significantly, the shadow on the wall had moved. It was now noticeably closer to Edmund's bed, its elongated form seeming to lean forward as if observing the sleeping subject more closely. This discovery eliminated any possibility that the shadow was a fixed feature of the room or a simple photographic artifact. Something in that study room had been moving, something that left no trace except for these inadvertent captures in what were supposed to be clinical documentation photographs. Sarah contacted Michael immediately, and together they began piecing together a timeline that grew more disturbing. With each revelation, Edmund's journal entries revealed that Professor Whitmore had been taking photographs at odd hours, often when Edmund was supposedly alone in the room. The professor had claimed these were routine documentation shots, but Edmund noted that the camera clicks often came from different positions, as if Whitmore was trying to capture something specific from various angles. The breakthrough came when Michael discovered a letter tucked behind the journal's back cover, written in Edmund's increasingly agitated handwriting. Dated November 20th, 1906, it was apparently never sent, but represented Edmund's attempt to document what he had discovered about the true nature of the study. "My dear brother," the letter began, "I must tell someone what I have witnessed here, though I fear you will think me mad. Professor Whitmore is not conducting a sleep study in any conventional sense. He speaks of manifestations of consciousness and capturing thought in physical form. He believes that certain individuals during specific states of altered consciousness can somehow project aspects of their awareness into the physical world. The shadow I have described is not, he claims, a trick of light or a photographic anomaly, but rather a visible manifestation of some part of the sleeping mind." The letter continued with Edmund's growing realization that he had been selected not as a random subject, but because Professor Whitmore believed he possessed this rare ability. The sleep study was merely a cover for what amounted to an experimental investigation into what the professor termed conscious projection phenomena. Sarah and Michael began researching Professor Whitmore himself, but found surprisingly little information. The Morpheus Laboratory had operated for less than 2 years, closing abruptly in early 1907 with no explanation in the public records. Whitmore seemed to have vanished from academic circles entirely after that point, leaving behind only these fragments of his unusual research. The final piece of the puzzle came from Edmund's last journal entry, dated November 22nd, 1906. His handwriting was notably different, more hurried and agitated than in previous entries. "I understand now what Professor Whitmore has been trying to accomplish. The photographs are not documentation of the study. They are proof of its success. He has been deliberately inducing states where the shadow appears, timing his camera work to capture it at its most visible. Tonight, when he showed me the photographs, I could see the triumph in his eyes. He spoke of presenting his findings to learned societies, of revolutionizing our understanding of human consciousness. But I fear what he has awakened in me will not simply disappear when the study ends. The shadow grows stronger each night, more defined, more independent. I have decided to leave tomorrow, with or without his permission." The journal entries ended there. But Michael had family records indicating that Edmund had indeed left the study abruptly and never spoke publicly about his experience. He lived another 40 years, but according to family stories, never slept well again and insisted on keeping multiple light sources burning in his bedroom every night. Sarah stared at the 2 photographs spread across her desk, understanding finally that she was looking at something unprecedented in the history of scientific research. These weren't clinical documentation photos at all, but rather Professor Whitmore's attempt to provide visual proof of his theories about consciousness and physical manifestation. The clinical setting, the professional notes, the official laboratory stamp, all of it had been an elaborate facade for what amounted to a highly personal and possibly dangerous investigation into the nature of human awareness itself. The shadow in the photographs was no photographic error or trick of light. According to Professor Whitmore's own theory, it was Edmund Thornton's consciousness made somehow visible, captured in the moment when his sleeping mind projected itself into the physical world. Whether one accepted this explanation or not, the photographic evidence was undeniable. Something had been in that room with Edmund, something that moved independently and appeared only under very specific circumstances. Sarah found herself returning to the photographs repeatedly over the following weeks, studying the shadow's form and position. There was something undeniably intentional about its placement, as if it were indeed observing Edmund rather than simply existing as a random anomaly. The more she examined the images, the more convinced she became that Professor Whitmore had achieved exactly what he set out to do. He had captured visual evidence of something that existed at the very edge of human understanding. The mystery of the 1906 sleep study would never be fully resolved. Professor Whitmore's research notes, if they ever existed, were lost to history. The Morpheus Laboratory's records had been destroyed or scattered. Edmund Thornton took his experiences to the grave, leaving behind only fragmentary accounts of phenomena that challenged every conventional understanding of consciousness and physical reality. But the photographs remained, clinical in their composition, yet containing something that transcended the boundaries of normal scientific documentation. In trying to present his research as legitimate medical study, Professor Whitmore had inadvertently created one of the most compelling pieces of anomalous evidence in the archives of human experience. The shadow on the wall was no longer a mystery to be explained away, but rather proof that some questions push the boundaries of what science can comfortably accommodate. Sarah finally filed the photographs in a special collection, marked not as routine medical documentation, but as examples of early experimental consciousness research. She included Edmund's journal and Michael's family history as contextual materials, creating a complete record of Professor Whitmore's hidden investigation. The collection would serve as a resource for future researchers, though Sarah suspected that most scholars would dismiss the materials as elaborate hoaxes or misunderstood natural phenomena. Before sealing the collection, Sarah made one final discovery that would fundamentally alter her understanding of the entire case. While organizing the administrative documents she had found alongside the photographs, she noticed a peculiar pattern in the Morpheus Laboratory's supply orders. Between October and November of 1906, Professor Whitmore had requested increasingly large quantities of silver nitrate and other photographic chemicals, far more than would be needed for routine documentation. More tellingly, he had also ordered specialized optical equipment, typically used in astronomical photography, including filters designed to capture light spectrums invisible to the human eye. The implications were staggering. Whitmore hadn't simply stumbled upon the shadow phenomenon. He had been systematically preparing to document it, using cutting-edge photographic techniques that pushed the boundaries of what was scientifically possible in 1906. The shadow wasn't an accidental capture, but the result of a carefully orchestrated investigation using equipment specifically designed to reveal hidden aspects of reality. Even more disturbing was a final invoice, dated just days before the laboratory's closure, for what appeared to be experimental chemicals from a supplier she couldn't identify. The substances listed, compounds with names that didn't correspond to any known photographic materials, suggested that Whitmore's final experiments had ventured into territories that went beyond conventional science, into realms that bordered on the alchemical. Michael returned to Portland with copies of everything they had discovered, planning to incorporate this story into his family history project. But he confided to Sarah that he had mixed feelings about preserving his great-grandfather's experience for future generations. The photographs and journal entries painted a picture of psychological trauma that had affected Edmund for the remainder of his life, and Michael worried about the impact these revelations might have on other family members. During their final meeting, Michael revealed one last detail that had emerged from his family research. Edmund's younger sister had kept a diary during the same period, and while most entries dealt with mundane domestic matters, she had recorded several nights when Edmund had appeared to be sleepwalking in his family home, something that had never happened before his participation in the study. According to the sister's account, Edmund would stand motionless in darkened rooms, facing blank walls, as if observing something invisible to everyone else. The behavior had continued sporadically for months after his return from the laboratory, gradually diminishing but never completely disappearing. Sometimes, late in the evening when the archive building was empty and quiet, Sarah would return to look at the photographs one more time. The shadow seemed different in those quiet moments, more pronounced somehow, as if the low light and silence create conditions similar to those Edmund had experienced over a century ago. She never mentioned these observations to anyone, but she understood finally why Edmund Thornton had insisted on keeping his bedroom brightly lit for the rest of his life. During one of these evening visits, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. In the second photograph, the one where the shadow appeared closer to Edmund's bed, there was a barely visible detail she had overlooked in all her previous examinations. At the very edge of the shadow's form, there appeared to be what looked like fingers, elongated, reaching toward the sleeping figure with unmistakable intention. The detail was so faint that it could only be seen under perfect lighting conditions, but once noticed, it could never be unseen. The 1906 sleep study represented something far more significant than its clinical appearance suggested. It was evidence of one researcher's obsessive attempt to push beyond the accepted boundaries of scientific inquiry, to capture and document phenomena that existed at the very limits of human perception. Whether Professor Whitmore succeeded or failed in his ultimate goals would remain forever unknown, but the shadow on the wall stood as permanent testimony to the lengths to which human curiosity will go in pursuit of the impossible. In the end, Sarah realized that the true horror of the photographs lay not in what they revealed about the supernatural, but in what they documented about the capacity for scientific obsession to override ethical considerations and human compassion. Professor Whitmore had achieved his goal of capturing anomalous phenomena, but at a cost that had destroyed both his subject's peace of mind and his own academic career. The shadow on the wall was not just evidence of consciousness projection, it was a warning about the dangers of pursuing knowledge without regard for its consequences.